Here we are, AP Biology. This is the videos on the chapter of animal diversity, so kind of the evolution of how animals became such diverse organisms. This is our third and final video. We are focused specifically on vertebrates in this video. The most important slide of this entire video is one I just skipped over. Sorry about that. Is this one right here. And basically it's showing us how the characteristics of the vertebrates kind of evolved. And so it's really important to keep in our head what are the major steps. And so if we look here, one of the first things that ever evolved was the brain. And then we developed kind of the head region, and within the head region we had a brain. Then we developed vertebrae, and once we've developed vertebrae or a backbone, we got jaws. So we have a movable jaw that allows us to bite and chew and swallow. Then we developed lungs, or something similar to lungs. Then we developed lobed fins, and what lobed fins turned into are the legs. And once we had the ability to walk, we ended up walking right out of the water evolutionarily. And then from there we developed the amniotic egg, which allowed us to give birth on land, or to produce eggs on land. And then from there we developed milk, which is a way of nourishing our young. So all of these are stepwise fashions of how the evolution of organisms has kind of changed over time. So if we're looking at the step-by-steps of evolution, one of the things we have to recognize is that there's some classifications. We're going to use the word chordates. Most chordates are vertebrates. That means they have a head and a backbone that are made up of vertebrae or backbone bones. So one of the first animals that is a vertebrae is called the lamprey. It's the earliest thing. Notice it's a fish. It kind of looks like an eelish thing. It does not have a hinged jaw. In fact, if you look at its mouth in the diagram, you'll see it's just a circular thing. But once we get past that, then we develop jaws and we have gills. And so these are things like fish. So first we had the lampreys and then we had fish. And the thing about fish is that not only do they have a backbone, do they have gills, but they have those fins, and the fins become important as we get closer to walking. The thing about them is there are the sharks and rays, which have a skeleton not made up of bones, but of cartilage, and that's an internal skeleton. Then we have the rayfin fish, and these are important because they have a skeleton that is actually hard, made of calcium phosphate. And the other thing is that they have this swim bladder thing that allows them to regulate where they are. One of the examples of a rayfin fish is the rainbow trout. And so it has a swim bladder which allows it to regulate how high up it's swimming. It has gills, and then it has kind of this hard reinforced skeleton inside of its body. Now, the biggest and most important thing that we're going to see when we go to the Academy of Science is the lobed fin fish. These are really important is because their fins actually have bones with muscles on them, and they would use their lobed fin fish and they would use them for walking on the bottom of the lakes and rivers and oceans that they were in. So these lobed fin fish actually have the development of a muscular system that is used for walking. Now, if you take one step further, you go from having a fish with fins to the development of those fins into what become legs. And now we have amphibians. We've developed amphibians. And the thing about the amphibians is that they have gills and they have bones that support those gills. They have limb or bone structures that look like hands, and they are used for movement. Now, what are the amphibians? These are frogs, toads, salamanders, these really cool kind of looking newts, things like that. And the cool thing about frogs is that in one lifetime of that animal, we're actually able to see the evolution of an aquatic fish with a tail, gills, all of that, to an organism that has legs, bones, and breathes using a lungs. So the frogs, in their own way, are the perfect example of the evolution from a fish to an animal that can survive on land. Now, if we go one step higher than that, when we look at frogs and things like that, the amphibians, we're going to talk about reptiles. And what reptiles are is they're classified as an amniote. And an amniote simply means it's something that makes amniotic eggs, or eggs that have that fluid inside of them. We call them tetrapods, and that's because they walk on 4 legs. And then they have the amniotic egg that's designed to be laid or live on land. And so a couple of things about reptiles is that they have things that are waterproof scales, so they can actually go in the water, and then they have this amniotic egg, which is a kind of a liquidy egg that can survive on land. Because up to this point, all the animals we've talked about have been aquatic, water-dwelling, water-reproducing organisms. Now, the thing about reptiles is that they're ectothermic, which means they're only able to have the same body temperature as the outside environment. So if it's warm outside, their body's warm. If it's cold, their body's cold, and they have a hard time moving. The thing about ectothermic animals is that there were dinosaurs. Dinosaurs are actually, people thought they were ectothermic, but they may have actually been endothermic, which means that they could produce their own body heat. And if you guys have a chance to see Walking with Dinosaurs, it's kind of a cute little kid movie, but it does have amazing graphics of what dinosaurs look like. Now, dinosaurs we now know are relatives of birds. And birds are important because they are nothing more than a reptile kind of creature with feathers and an amniotic egg. And those feathers allow them to regulate their temperature a little bit better. We now know that dinosaurs had feathers as well. If you go, again, a step higher up, you get to mammals. And what mammals have is they are amniotes, which means they have not an amniotic egg, but they use amniotic fluid. They have hair instead of feathers, and then we produce milk. The hair is used to insulate our body so that we can maintain our own body temperature, so that's endothermic. And we produce milk as a way of nurturing and caring for our young. Now, there are some exceptions to this kind of rule. There are monotremes, and what monotremes are like our duck-billed platypus. They actually lay eggs. So they produce milk, they have hair, but they lay an egg just like a reptile would. There are some examples like marsupials. So kangaroos, what they do is they actually nurture using a placenta. And these are embryos. So they actually give birth to this tiny little baby, and then they nurture it outside of their body, whereas we give birth to a fully developed baby. Here's the marsupial. So they actually complete that development, as I was saying, not in utero, but actually in the pouch, but they're still attached, okay? Now, these are zebras. These are special because this is what humans are, right? These are animals that develop in a placenta, they completely develop, and then they pop out at birth. Now, if we were to look at kind of animals' phylogenetic tree, we do realize that it is a work in progress. There are changes that happen kind of based on new evidence. Usually the evidence is molecular, so we're looking at DNA, proteins, things like that. And so what happens is sometimes we have to make some distinctions or kind of some classification adjustments. And then the other thing that we can use is not only molecular evidence, but we can also do it based on body plans. So they used to do body plans and say, oh, these are all radially symmetrical, these are all bilateral. Or they would say, oh, these guys have legs and these guys don't have legs, and oh, these guys are worm-like, and oh, these are too. And so they would do it like that. Well, that works for the most part, but then again, as we get more evidence, the picture gets more and more complete. And so lastly, we have to recognize that the animal diversity that we currently have is dependent upon the environment in which those animals live in. And as humans continue to populate and continue to invade, what happens is we're actually threatening animal diversity. And one of the things that have happened is like introduction of non-native species. So if you guys look at this picture right here, this is the cane toad. It's poisonous. It's actually not native, and it accidentally got to Australia. And once it was there, it found an environment that it loved. And it's reproducing like crazy to the point where it's actually destroying crops, wildlife, and everything else. Because if an animal eats the poisonous cane toad, it dies. And so all of these different populations are dying off as a result of this poisonous cane toad. So much so that, in fact, the government now has a bounty on their heads. So people can go out and make a living by just simply killing cane toads. Another example was rabbits that were in Australia. They were reproducing and populating like crazy. They were actually eating all of the food, which was then starving other native species out. So much so that, again, the government stepped in and they actually poisoned the rabbits themselves. So we have to keep in mind that just because we look at the evolution, we have to recognize that humans play a role in that.